September 3rd, 1939. The North Atlantic, 250 miles northwest of Ireland. On the decks of the passenger liner, SS Athenia, 1,418 souls, many of them women and children fleeing the inevitability of war, believed themselves safe. They were wrong. Below the darkening surface, Kapitän-Leutnant Fritz Julius Lemp, commanding U-30, watched the liner through his periscope. Believing her to be an armed merchant cruiser, he gave the order to fire. At 7:43 p.m., a single torpedo tore into the Athenia's port side. The explosion was catastrophic. The ship, mortally wounded, began to settle. Within hours, 117 civilians and crew would be dead. The first British casualties of the Second World War, killed less than 10 hours after the declaration of war. This single, brutal act was not an isolated incident. It was the opening shot in the longest, most grueling campaign of the entire conflict. This was the Battle of the Atlantic, a 6-year struggle for the survival of Great Britain itself. It was a war of logistics, a grim arithmetic of sunken tonnage versus replacement hulls, of lives lost versus supplies delivered. In these opening months, Germany's U-boats seemed to be winning this war of attrition single-handedly, their wolfpacks appearing to be an invincible force. But this early dominance was a deadly illusion, a tactical success that masked a looming strategic failure. The story of the Atlantic is not just the story of the hunter, it is the story of how the hunted learned, adapted, and ultimately perfected a system, the convoy, that would turn the tide and break the back of the U-boat force. The initial period of U-boat dominance, from late 1939 through 1940, was so successful that the German crews themselves gave it a name, Die gut glückliche Zeit, or the happy time. The U-boat aces, men like Günther Prien, Joachim Schepke, and the most lethal of them all, Otto Kretschmer, became heroes of the Reich, their faces plastered on propaganda posters. Kretschmer, known as Silent Otto for his mastery of the surface night attack and his strict adherence to radio silence, embodied this early confidence. Commanding U-99, he held to a chillingly effective motto, one torpedo, one ship. His own war diaries reflect a cold, almost clinical approach to maritime destruction. Kretschmer pioneered the tactic of penetrating directly into the convoy columns at night, a maneuver so audacious that Allied escorts, still reliant on primitive ASDIC, sonar, that was useless against a surfaced submarine, were left bewildered. Kretschmer's method, as he later documented, was terrifyingly simple. He would gate-crash the convoy, using the darkness and the rain as cover, slipping past the escorting corvettes. The escorts, he recalled, had no idea we were there. We were inside the herd. The steamers were unescorted, like sheep in a pen. It was just a question of choosing which one to sink first. He would then fire his torpedoes at point-blank range, sometimes as close as 500 yards, ensuring a kill. He would dive only to reload or to escape a concerted counterattack, which in 1940 was rare and often ineffective. In one patrol, Kretschmer sank 7 ships in a single night. This was not warfare as the Allies understood it. It was a slaughter. For the men of the British Merchant Navy, this was a time of unrelenting terror. They were the true front line of the Battle of the Atlantic, sailing in slow, obsolete vessels, often alone, with no defence save a single, obsolete deck gun and a prayer. The memoirs of the merchant seamen who survived this period are a litany of fire, freezing water, and agonizing helplessness. They described the sudden, deafening crump of a torpedo striking the hull, a sound that, once heard, was never forgotten. They wrote of the immediate plunge into chaos, the screech of tearing metal, the roar of escaping steam, the darkness of the engine rooms filling with oil and water, and the desperate scramble for lifeboats that were often shattered by the blast. A survivor from one of the ships in convoy SC-7, which was decimated by a wolfpack in October 1940, later recounted the experience. You hear the explosion, and you just know, you're done. The ship lists almost instantly, Men are screaming, or they're silent. The silent ones are the worst. You jump into the Atlantic, and the cold hits you like a solid wall. It's not water, it's ice. You see your ship, your home, slide under the waves, bow first, and then you see the other ships in the convoy just sailing on. They can't stop. To stop is to die themselves. This was the grim reality. The convoy system, in its infancy, was rigid and deeply flawed. The stay with the convoy rule was absolute, and stopping to rescue survivors was a luxury that could not be afforded. This was the imbalance that defined the early war. On one side, the U-boat, a perfect predator, operating with tactical brilliance and ruthless efficiency, commanded by men who saw the war as a mathematical problem of tonnage. On the other, the merchant seaman, a civilian in all but name, floating on a steel box of vital supplies, protected by nothing but luck. The U-boats were not just sinking ships, they were strangling the lifeblood of an island nation. Britain was hemorrhaging supplies, food and fuel, and as 1,940 bled into 1,941, the lights all over Britain were dimming. The terror of the happy time was not just the fear of the torpedo, but the dawning, terrifying realization that, left unchecked, the wolves would win. The Battle of the Atlantic was not a traditional war. It was not a campaign fought for ground, for cities, or for the capture of symbolic flags. It was a cold, brutal, and unseen war of mathematics. The Germans had a name for it, Tonnenkrieg, the Tonnage War. This was a war of pure attrition, a contest of ledgers, a strategic strangulation designed to starve an island nation into submission. Great Britain, in 1939, was the heart of a global empire, but it was a heart that relied on a constant, uninterrupted flow of blood from arteries that stretched thousands of miles across the open ocean. Britain's dependency was absolute, a fact that was not a secret but a simple, terrifying reality of its geography. Pre-war, the nation imported over 55 million tons of goods annually. This was not a luxury. It was the baseline for survival. This figure included more than half of its food, 100% of its oil, and the vast majority of its raw materials, iron ore, bauxite, cotton, rubber needed to fuel the very war factories that were its only hope of fighting back. Every tank built in Birmingham, every Spitfire assembled in Southampton, every shell fired by the Royal Navy was a product of the sea lanes. This was Britain's strategic vulnerability, and Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat force, intended to exploit it to the point of death. The Tonnage War was a simple, grim equation. Dönitz calculated that if his U-boats could sink merchant shipping faster than the Allies could build replacements, Britain would collapse. He didn't need to invade. He didn't need to win the air war. He simply needed to sever the lifeline. He estimated that a sustained sinking rate of 700,000 tons per month would bring Britain to its knees within 6 to 12 months. This figure became the obsessive, driving benchmark for the U-boat command, a daily quota of destruction. This unseen mathematical threat, more than the visible terror of the Blitz, was what kept Winston Churchill awake at night. In his post-war memoirs, Their Finest Hour, Churchill penned one of the most revealing statements of his leadership. He wrote, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril." This admission is profound. Churchill, the man who had faced the collapse of France, the evacuation at Dunkirk, and the nightly bombing of London with defiant rhetoric, confessed that his deepest fear was not a bomb, but a statistic. He understood the Tonnage War with a chilling clarity. The bombs of the Luftwaffe, while terrifying, were a perceptible and direct assault. They tested the nerve and willpower of the populace. But the U-boat, as he wrote, was a different kind of danger. His fear was rooted in its insidious, invisible, and existential nature. He explained, "It was a struggle of bookkeeping. Our power today to wage war or even to live depended on our feasting at the grand table of the oceans. The U-boat attacked this table. The sinking of a ship was not just a single tragic event, it was a cascading failure. A single freighter, a 7,000-ton vessel, could be carrying 10,000 tons of cargo. That might be enough food to feed a city for a week, or enough oil to fuel a destroyer squadron, or enough aluminum to build a fleet of bombers. When it was lost, all of it was lost. The crew, the ship, the cargo, and the import value for the entire year all gone to the bottom of the sea. Churchill watched the weekly tonnage lost reports with a dread he felt for no other aspect of the war. He knew that unlike a battlefield, which could be retaken, these losses were permanent. The statistics from 1,940 and 1,941 justified his dread. They were catastrophic. During the happy time, the U-boats were meeting and exceeding Dönitz's quotas with horrifying efficiency. In the second half of 1,940 alone, nearly 2.2 million tons of Allied shipping were sent to the bottom of the Atlantic. In October 1940, a month of carnage, convoys SC-7 and HX-79 were savaged. In just 2 nights, wolfpacks sank 38 ships from these 2 convoys alone, a loss of over 150,000 tons. The U-boats, operating in groups, overwhelmed the pitifully few and inadequate escorts. For the U-boat crews it was, as Otto Kretschmer had stated, like shooting sheep in a pen. The cost to the U-boat arm was almost non-existent. In all of 1940, while sinking millions of tons of shipping, the Germans lost only 24 U-boats. The exchange rate was overwhelmingly, suicidally in their favour. Britain was hemorrhaging ships at a rate that was completely unsustainable. Its own shipyards, even working at maximum capacity, could not replace the losses. They were building perhaps 1.5 million tons a year, while losing nearly 3 or 4 times that amount. The impact of this statistical drain was felt in every home and factory in Britain. Rations, introduced in January 1940, became progressively more severe. The meat ration was cut, then cut again. Bacon, butter, and sugar were luxuries. Even bread was on the verge of being rationed, a move Churchill resisted, knowing the devastating blow it would be to civilian morale. More critically, the nation's oil reserves dwindled to a terrifying low. At one point in 1941, Britain had only enough oil to fuel its home fleet for a handful of major operations. The Royal Navy, the shield of the Empire, was in danger of being anchored in harbour, not by enemy guns, but by an empty fuel gauge. War production in factories sputtered, as assembly lines waited for rubber from Malaya or bauxite from the Americas that would never arrive. This was the true state of the Battle of the Atlantic in 1941. It was not a phony war or a distant naval affair. It was a silent, desperate struggle for survival, measured in cargo manifests and sinking reports. The U-boat was not just an enemy. It was an unseen, mathematical void, swallowing Britain's future one ship at a time. The nation was on the brink of a collapse as total and definitive as any invasion. The Tonnage War was working, and the man who had perfected this deadly equation was watching from his headquarters in Lorient, preparing to tighten the noose. The devastating success of the Tonnage War was not an accident of fate. It was the deliberate, meticulously planned execution of a singular vision, championed by one man, Admiral Karl Dönitz. To the Allied sailors, he was a nameless, shadowy threat. To his own men, he was Der Loer, the Lion. But his most accurate title, the one he held with obsessive focus, was Befehlshaber der U-Boot, BDU, commander of the U-boats. He was not merely a flag officer. He was the architect, the high priest, and the ruthless nerve center of Germany's submarine campaign. Dönitz was a U-boat man to his core. His worldview had been forged in the crucible of the First World War, where he had commanded U-boats himself, experienced the thrill of the hunt, and ultimately been captured by the British after scuttling his own damaged boat. This experience did not break him, it galvanized him. He spent his interwar years in a navy shackled by the Treaty of Versailles, relentlessly studying the successes and failures of the first U-boat campaign. He concluded that the lone wolf tactics of WWII, while effective, were too random. The advent of ASDIC, sonar, and the convoy system had rendered them obsolete. His solution was not just a new tactic, but a new doctrine. Rudal tactic, the wolfpack. The wolfpack was a revolutionary concept, a true force multiplier that turned the vast, empty ocean from an Allied advantage into a German hunting ground. The genius of the doctrine was its blend of decentralized execution and centralized command. It acknowledged that a single U-boat, submerged, was slow, blind, and vulnerable. But on the surface, particularly at night, a U-boat was faster than the primary Allied escort, the Flower-class corvette. It was also a tiny silhouette, nearly invisible to the naked eye and, most critically, completely invisible to the Allied ASDIC, which could only detect submerged targets. The hunt was a collaborative, orchestrated affair. A single U-boat, scouting a known convoy route, would make contact. This shadower would not attack. Its job was to submerge, let the convoy pass overhead, then surface behind it and shadow it from a safe distance, broadcasting its course, speed, and composition directly to Dönitz's headquarters. From his command bunker, first in Lorient, France, and later in Berlin, Dönitz and his staff became the conductors. They would receive the shadower's signal and immediately transmit orders to every other U-boat within a 100-mile radius, vectoring them in like a pack of wolves homing on a scent. Over the next day or two, the pack would assemble, a submerged, unseen perimeter around the convoy, waiting for the signal. Then, as darkness fell, Dönitz would unleash them. The U-boats would surface en masse, charging in from different directions, their low profiles hidden in the rough Atlantic swells. They would race times inside times the convoy's escort screen, firing torpedoes at point-blank range, then turning to fire their stern tubes. The escorts were thrown into chaos. They were outnumbered, outrun, and blind. Their ASDIC was useless against the surfaced U-boats, and their radar, in the early years, was non-existent or primitive. The escorts would charge off to chase one U-boat, opening a gap for 3 more to attack. As Dönitz himself wrote in his post-war memoirs, 10 years and 20 days, his U-boats were fighting with a rapier against a bludgeon. The U-boat had to attack where the enemy was weakest. The surfaced night attack turned the convoy, intended as a fortress, into a panicked herd, and the escorts, intended as shepherds, into helpless witnesses. Dönitz's strategic mind was consumed by this single-minded focus. He was a constant and vocal antagonist to the big ship advocates within the Kriegsmarine, particularly Grand Admiral Erich Raeder. Dönitz viewed battleships like the Bismarck and Tirpitz as monstrous wastes of steel. He argued, correctly, that they were a relic of a past age, a prestige fleet that could be contained by British sea power. In his diaries, he lamented the resources poured into these grey elephants. He had pleaded with Hitler and Raeder before the war, arguing in a 1939 memorandum that with a fleet of 300 U-boats, a number he saw as the bare minimum he could achieve the 700,000-ton monthly sinking rate and win the war. Instead, he began the war with only 57 U-boats, many of them small coastal ducks unsuitable for the Atlantic. This dual conflict, a war for resources at home and a war of tonnage at sea, defined his command. He was convinced, as he later wrote, that the U-boat arm was the only arm which was in a position to strike directly at England and to win the war by itself. This obsessive focus was matched by his unique style of leadership. Dönitz was not a remote admiral. He was a fanatical, hands-on commander who fostered a fierce, almost familial loyalty. He referred to his U-boat crews as mine youngs, or my boys. He made it a point to be on the docks at Lorient or Saint-Nazaire when a U-boat returned from patrol, ready with a handshake, a congratulation, and an immediate, detailed debrief of the captain. He cultivated an elite esprit de corps, a brotherhood of men who were, in his eyes, the true tip of Germany's spear. This personal touch, this shared sense of being a special, elite force, was a powerful motivator. It created men who would willingly sail into the most extreme danger, time and time again, driven by a personal loyalty to their commander and the pack. This combination of a revolutionary tactic, a centralized nervous system, and a fiercely loyal officer corps made the U-boat force of 1,940 to 1,942 the most lethal naval weapon on Earth. Dönitz was the brain, the wolfpack was the teeth, and the tonnage war was the bloody result. He had found the Allies' single greatest weakness and was exploiting it with a mathematician's cold precision and a true believer's zeal. He had perfected the art of the kill, and his boys were executing it in the one place the Allies could least afford to be weak, the vast, unforgiving, and unprotected centre of the ocean. The hunting ground where Karl Dönitz's wolfpacks achieved their most terrible successes was not defined by a coastline or a fortress, but by a void. It was a vast, cold, and lethal stretch of the North Atlantic known to the Allied sailors who dreaded it as the Black Pit. This was the Mid-Atlantic Gap, a desolate expanse of ocean stretching roughly 1,000 miles wide, centred between the air bases in Newfoundland, Iceland, and Northern Ireland. It was a geographic dead zone, a region of the ocean that lay beyond the maximum effective range of Allied land-based air cover. In this void, the U-boat was king. Here, the convoys were blind, vulnerable, and almost entirely alone. The Black Pit was a symptom of a critical Allied failure, a crisis of technology, resources, and range. While the U-boats could roam the entire Atlantic, the Allied defences could not. The convoys, upon leaving Halifax, Canada, would be protected for the first few hundred miles by RCAF aircraft. Similarly, convoys approaching Britain would receive air cover from RAF Coastal Command based in the UK and Iceland, but in the middle, the aircraft turned back. Their fuel tanks were empty, their range was exhausted. For 3 to 5 agonizing days, depending on the weather, the merchant ships and their escorts were on their own. The U-boats knew this. Dönitz vectored his wolfpacks into this gap like a predator staking out a watering hole. Here, they could surface in broad daylight with impunity, recharge their batteries, and leisurely take up attack positions, knowing there was no Sunderland or Catalina aircraft lurking in the clouds to drop a spread of depth charges. Compounding this lack of air cover was the desperate inadequacy of the surface escorts themselves. The backbone of the early convoy defence was the Flower-class corvette. These ships, numbering in the hundreds, were a testament to rapid, desperate improvisation. They were based on a whaler design, cheap and quick to build, but they were never intended for North Atlantic warfare. They were, as one of their commanders famously stated, a design for a ship to be built by men who had never built ships, to be sailed by men who had never sailed. They were small, at just over 200 feet, and dangerously unstable. They were known to roll on wet grass, tossing men from their bunks and making even the simplest task of heating a meal a near impossibility. Commander Peter Gretton, a highly successful escort commander of B-7 Escort Group, wrote extensively of the Flower class's limitations. In his memoirs, he described the brutal reality. They were terribly lively. In a head sea, the spray came over the bridge, and in the winter, this froze at once, adding weight which had to be chipped away. Life on board was a misery of cold, wet, and unrelenting exhaustion. But more critically, the corvettes were slow. With a top speed of about 16 knots, they were, in a calm sea, only marginally faster than a surfaced U-boat. In the heavy swells of a gale, the U-boat's favoured hunting weather, the corvette's speed would drop dramatically, while the U-boat, running on the surface, could often outpace them. The novelist Nicholas Montserrat, who served as an officer on Flower-class corvettes, immortalised this brutal existence in his novel, The Cruel Sea. His work, though fictionalised, was drawn directly from his logbooks and experiences. He described the visceral, sickening lurch of the ship, the constant, deafening ping of the ASDIC, and the agonising frustration of the hunt. The corvette, he wrote, was a puny atom in a vast, cold and malignant sea. Always at the mercy of the weather, always at the mercy of the U-boat. This was the reality for the escort crews. They were fighting a technologically superior predator in an environment that was actively trying to kill them, all while being deaf, blind, and exhausted. Their primary weapon, ASDIC, sonar, was a primitive tool. It was a searchlight of sound that was only effective against a submerged target. It was completely blind to a surfaced U-boat. Furthermore, the violent pitching and rolling of a corvette in a storm made the ASDIC dome lift out of the water, breaking contact. The system was also easily confused. A whale, a temperature layer in the water, or even the wake of another ship, could produce a false echo, sending the escorts on a ghost hunt while the real U-boat slipped away. And even when a U-boat was detected and depth-charged, the corvette would lose all contact in the final moments of the attack as the target passed beneath them, a blind spot the U-boat captains exploited to escape. The statistical proof of this lethal combination is written in the sinking charts of 1941 and 1942. The graphs of Allied losses spike in a horrifying correlation with the geography of the Black Pit. Convoys like SC 42 inches September 1941 were a case study in this slaughter. Spotted in the gap, the convoy of 64 merchant ships was swarmed by a wolfpack. Its single escort group, composed of a destroyer and 3 corvettes, was hopelessly overwhelmed. Over 2 nights, 15 ships were sunk, and 2 more were damaged, with no U-boats lost. The escorts, as one survivor put it, were just dashing about, firing depth charges and flares, but it was useless. They were everywhere. The Black Pit was more than a location. It was a symbol of the Allies' desperate technological and strategic lag. It represented the precise point where their defences failed, where their air power ended, and their surface ships were outmatched. It was a vacuum of power, and into this vacuum, Dönitz poured his wolves. For the Allied merchantmen, entering the gap was a descent into a special kind of hell, a place where the horizon was empty of friendly wings, and the sea itself was the lair of an unseen, unbeatable enemy. The survival of Britain depended entirely on finding a way to close this gap. The strategic horror of the Black Pit, with its cold statistics of tonnage and its geographic voids, can obscure the human and tactical realities of the war. To understand the Battle of the Atlantic, we must zoom in from the map room to the control room of a single U-boat, to the very document that chronicled its life and death, the Kriegstagebuch, or KTB, the official war diary. This log, kept meticulously by every U-boat commander, was a cold, precise record of every torpedo fired, every ship sighted, and every order given. And in the KTB of times Korvettenkapitän times Werner Hartenstein, commander of U-156, we find the record of a single event that would fundamentally and brutally change the nature of the entire campaign. On the 12th of September 1942, Hartenstein was on patrol in the South Atlantic, off the coast of Africa, an area that was its own Black Pit. At 11:37 a.m., his lookouts spotted smoke. His KTB entry is clinical, the language of a professional hunter. Smoke plume sighted, bearing 340, moving west, will shadow and attack after dusk. The target was the RMS Times Laconia Asterisk, a 20,000-ton British troopship, sailing alone. For hours, Hartenstein stalked his prey. At 8:07 p.m., he surfaced. The log is precise. 4 torpedoes fired, 2 hits. He noted the immediate, heavy list to be planes, starboard, and the fact that the ship was settling fast. It was a textbook attack, another 20,000 tons for the ledger. Hartenstein remained surface to observe the sinking, a standard practice. Then, the war of mathematics was shattered by a human reality. As U-156 closed on the lifeboats, Hartenstein's crew began to hear voices in the darkness. They were not speaking English. They were speaking Italian. Hartenstein's subsequent radio message to BDU, U-Boat Command, is one of the most frantic and surreal in the archives of the war. Sunk by me, British Times Laconia Asterisk. unfortunately with 1,500 Italian prisoners of war. So far, 90 rescued. Ship has 20 lifeboats. Request orders. The Times, Laconia Times, was not just a troop ship. It was a floating prison for 1,800 Italian soldiers, Germany's own allies, captured in the North African campaign, along with 80 civilian women and children. Werner Hartenstein was now faced with an impossible choice. He was a U-boat commander, a hunter, but he was also a pre-war naval officer operating under the old codes of the sea. His next action was unprecedented. He made an independent decision that defied every rule of U-boat warfare. He ordered his crew to begin a massive rescue operation. He surfaced his U-boat, a vessel designed for stealth, in the middle of a war zone, and turned it into a refugee ship. He crammed over 200 survivors, many of them Italian, onto his decks and into his sub. He then ordered his radioman to broadcast an uncoded message in plain English on the International Maritime Distress Frequency. If any ship will assist the shipwrecked Times, Laconia Times crew, I will not attack her, providing I am not attacked by ship or air force. I have picked up 193 men, 4 to 53 south, 11 to 26 west. German submarine. He even had his crew fashion a large Red Cross flag and drape it over his forward gun deck. Hartenstein was not alone. Dönitz, upon receiving the signal, ordered 2 other U-boats, U-506 and U-507, and an Italian submarine, the Times Cappellini *, to race to the scene and assist in the rescue. For a brief, extraordinary moment, the war stopped. The wolves had turned into shepherds. Hartenstein's log entries for the next 2 days are a catalogue of human misery and desperate, improvised humanitarianism, as he towed lifeboats and coordinated the arrival of the other submarines. Then, on September 16th, the new reality of the tonnage war arrived from the sky. An American B-24 Liberator bomber, operating from a secret airbase on Ascension Island, appeared on the horizon. The B-24 pilot, Lieutenant James D. Harden, circled the bizarre scene. A German U-boat, flying a Red Cross flag, its decks crammed with hundreds of shipwrecked survivors, towing lifeboats. Harden was radioed by his base commander, Captain Robert C. Richardson III, who, despite being aware of the situation, issued a chillingly clear order. Sink sub. Hartenstein's log describes the disbelief. The B-24, a symbol of Allied air power, was not there to help, it was there to kill. As the survivors on his deck waved frantically, the B-24 made its first pass, dropping bombs. Hartenstein's KTB. Aircraft attacking, Red Cross flag, bombs. All survivors, all my men, on deck. The bombs straddled the U-boat, killing dozens in the lifeboats. Hartenstein screamed at the survivors on his deck. Off! Off! Get off my boat! I must dive. U-156 was damaged, its batteries leaking, but it managed to submerge, leaving the very survivors it had rescued to the mercy of the ocean and the B-24, which returned to drop depth charges. The Laconia incident, as it came to be known, had an immediate and brutal consequence. When a furious Karl Dönitz received Hartenstein's full report, he saw his own commander's humanitarian instincts as a fatal operational weakness. The war, for him, had no room for such chivalry. On the 17th of September 1942, he issued Triton Null, an order that would forever be known as the Laconia Order. It was distributed to all U-boats. Its text is primary evidence of the war's final descent into total brutality. All attempts to rescue members of sunken ships, including the fishing out of swimming men and the provision of food and water, are to cease. Rescue contradicts the most basic demands of warfare, the destruction of enemy ships and their crews. Be hard. Remember that the enemy has no regard for women and children when he bombs German cities. The tonnage war was now total. The single act of one American pilot, following orders, had given Dönitz the justification to formally strip away the last vestiges of maritime honor. Hartenstein's log, which began as a clinical record of a sinking, had become the epitaph for an older and perhaps more humane way of war. From this point forward, there would be no quarter given in the Battle of the Atlantic. The Battle of the Atlantic was a war of two fronts. The first was the cold, wet, and lethal front in the Black Pit, a war of torpedoes and depth charges. The second, and arguably the more decisive, was a war of rivets and blueprints, of steel plate and welding torches. This was the Industrial War, a brutal contest of production timetables fought in the shipyards of Hamburg and the steel mills of Pennsylvania. It was a war personified by two titans of industry, Albert Speer, Hitler's brilliant Minister of Armaments, and Henry J. Kaiser, the American industrialist who would, quite literally, build the ocean. On the German side, the challenge was formidable. Albert Speer, a man who had revolutionized German war production, faced a unique problem with the U-boat. A submarine was not a tank. It was not a mass-producible iron box. It was a high-precision, complex machine, a watertight, pressure-resistant vessel crammed with engines, batteries, torpedo tubes, and delicate listening gear. In his memoirs, Inside the Third Reich, Speer detailed this constant, frustrating battle for resources. He was in a perpetual tug-of-war with the Wehrmacht, which demanded tanks for the Eastern Front, and the Luftwaffe, which demanded fighters to stop the Allied bombing. U-boat construction was a craft, not an assembly line. It was meticulous, time-consuming, and devoured skilled labor, especially high-quality welders, a trade that took years to master. Speer wrote of the bottlenecks in components, from the high-grade steel for pressure hulls to the optical glass for periscopes. While Dönitz, now a Grand Admiral, was screaming for his 300 U-boats, Speer was struggling to deliver. In 1940, German yards produced only 50 U-boats. In 1941, this improved to 195, and in 1942, at the peak of their effort, 288. These numbers, while impressive, were never enough to create the overwhelming swarm Dönitz knew he needed. The average construction time for a Type 7 U-boat, from laying the keel to its first patrol, remained stubbornly high, often taking the better part of a year. Speer was fueling the Tonnage War, but he was doing it with a teaspoon. Across the Atlantic, the Allies were about to turn on a fire hose. The sleeping industrial giant of the United States had awakened, and its response to the Tonnage War was embodied by a single, irascible, cigar-chomping industrialist named Henry J. Kaiser. Kaiser had built dams and bridges. He had never built a ship. This, it turned out, was his greatest advantage. He looked at traditional shipbuilding, where a vessel was built piece by piece on a slipway, a process of craft, and saw it as a hopelessly obsolete bottleneck. He did not want to build ships. He wanted to times them, just like a Ford Model T. He was given the contract for a prefabricated emergency cargo ship design, derided by traditionalists as a dreadful-looking object. This was the emergency cargo, EC2-SC1, which would become legend, the Liberty ship. Kaiser's revolution was simple. He moved the work off the slipway. In his new shipyards, which sprang up from barren mudflats in California and Oregon, he used prefabrication. The double bottoms, the bow sections, the deck houses all were built in separate workshops across the country, shipped to the yard on flat cars, and then welded together in massive, pre-built modules. He replaced the slow, laborious process of riveting with the faster, stronger method of welding, training an army of workers, including thousands of Rosie the Riveter women, to do the job. The results were not just revolutionary, they were statistically insane. The first Liberty ships in 1941 took over 230 days to build. By late 1942, Kaiser's yards had reduced this to an average of 48 days. His Richmond, California yard set a record by building the SS Times Robert E. Peary Times in a staged publicity event. The keel was laid on November 8, 1942. The ship was launched 4 days, 15 hours, and 29 minutes later, and was fully fitted out and at sea 3 days after that. While the Times Peary Times was a stunt, the average was no less terrifying for German analysts. By 1943, the Allies were launching a new ship every 10 to 12 hours. Now, we apply the industrial hammer. Let us compare the two sides in a single, brutal statistical table. In 1942, at the absolute peak of the happy time for the U-boats, when they sank a devastating 6.2 million tons of Allied shipping, the Allies' Times, still Times, outbuilt them. That same year, Allied shipyards, powered by Kaiser's revolution, launched over 7 million tons of new shipping. The ledger had tipped. For the first time, the Allies were building ships faster than Dönitz could sink them. The Tonnage War, the core of German strategy, was mathematically lost, not in the shipyards of California, but in the shipyards of California. This graph, tons sunk versus tons built, was the single most important chart of the Atlantic War. From late 1942 onward, the Allied line of replacement rose almost vertically, while the German sinking line, though still high, began to falter. The U-boat crews were succeeding, sinking more and more ships, but they were, as one historian noted, bailing a rowboat with a teaspoon while the tide came in. Dönitz had begun the war with 57 U-boats. By the start of 1943, he had his 300 U-boats on station. But it was too late. He had won the tactical fight of 1941 only to be confronted by an industrial, strategic checkmate. He had brought a fleet of precision-made rapiers to the fight, only to see his enemy respond by building a factory that produced an endless, unstoppable supply of steel bludgeons. The U-boat, a brilliant weapon of ambush, was about to be drowned in a sea of Allied steel. And that was times before times the Allies had even perfected the new technologies of the hunt. The crushing weight of Allied steel, launched from Kaiser's miracle shipyards, bought Great Britain the most precious commodity in war: time. It replaced the losses and stemmed the bleeding, but it did not by itself win the battle. The Tonnage War was a two-variable equation: ships lost versus ships built. The Liberty ship program had solved the built variable, but the lost variable remained lethally high. To win, the Allies had to stop building faster and start sinking faster. They had to turn their beleaguered defensive escorts, their sheepdogs, into apex predators. This victory would not be forged in a shipyard, but in a laboratory. It was a war of science, and the goal was to systematically dismantle the U-boat's single greatest advantage: its invisibility. The U-boat was a weapon of stealth. It hunted from the depths using ASDIC's blind spots, and it hunted from the surface at night, invisible to radar and the naked eye. The Allied technological response was a triad of new systems, each designed to strip away one of these layers of invisibility. The first layer was the submerged hunt. The Allies' primary tool, ASDIC, had been a flawed weapon. As discussed, its ping was a cone of sound that could not detect a surfaced U-boat, and more frustratingly, created a blind spot in the final, critical moments of an attack. As a corvette or destroyer sailed times over times the U-boat's predicted position to drop its depth charges from the stern, it would lose all ASDIC contact. The U-boat captain, hearing the ping disappear, knew this was the moment to take drastic evasive action, turning hard or diving deep. The depth charge, a weapon of concussion, was also a barrage weapon, requiring a huge, imprecise pattern to have any chance of a kill, often just shaking the U-boat without breaking its hull. The solution was a British innovation called Hedgehog. It was not a depth charge, it was a forward-throwing mortar. Mounted on the bow of an escort, Hedgehog was a rack of 24 spigot mortars, small ashcan-sized bombs that were fired times ahead, times of the ship. This was its genius. The escort could now attack while still advancing times towards times the U-boat, never breaking ASDIC contact. The bombs flew in a circular pattern, landing in the water 200 yards ahead, and sank. Even better, they were not proximity fused, they were contact fused. They would only explode if they physically hit times the U-boat's hull. This had a devastating psychological and practical effect. There were no more massive, morale-shaking but harmless explosions. The sea would remain silent until a single, sharp crack or a series of small, popping explosions signified a direct hit and a kill, often followed by the grim evidence of oil and debris rising to the surface. Hedgehog had solved the final 100 yards problem, turning ASDIC from a detection tool into a lethal killing system. The second, and far more revolutionary, innovation was radar. This was the true killer technology, the one that broke the back of Dönitz's Times, Rudeltaktik **. Early Allied radar, operating on a 1.5-meter wavelength, was clumsy. It had a long range but a low resolution, and worse, the Germans had developed a simple, effective counter. A Metox receiver, a crude wooden box with an antenna, could hear the 1.5-meter radar signal long before the radar itself could get a return. For the U-boat commander, the Metox was a godsend. It bleeped a warning, giving him ample time to dive to safety. This led to a period of false confidence in the U-boat arm, as they believed they had mastered this new Allied magic. They were wrong. Allied scientists, working in secret, had made a quantum leap, microwave radar. Using a cavity magnetron, they developed a radar system that operated on a 10-centimeter wavelength. This was a game-changer for two reasons. First, the shorter wavelength gave a crystal-clear, high-resolution picture on the radar screen, so small it could be fitted onto ships, the Type 271, and, crucially, onto aircraft. It could pick out a U-boat's conning tower, or even a periscope from miles away, in total darkness, in a driving storm. Second, and most lethally, the 10-centimeter frequency was completely invisible to the German Metox receivers. The Germans, physically unaware such high-frequency radar was even possible, had no way to detect it. For the U-boat crews, the effect was sudden, terrifying, and seemingly supernatural. Herbert Werner, a U-boat officer who survived the war, chronicled this terror in his memoir, Iron Coffins. He described surfaced, recharging at night, in a raging gale, feeling perfectly safe, when suddenly, out of the blackness. Out of the storm, a British destroyer would appear, its searchlight pinning them, its guns already firing. They had no warning, no bleep from the Metox, nothing. They were blind, and the Allies, guided by an invisible hand, could suddenly see in the dark. Dönitz's entire surfaced wolfpack doctrine, which relied on nighttime invisibility, was rendered obsolete, almost overnight. The final piece of the triad was high-frequency direction finding, or HUF-DUF. This system attacked the very nerve center of the wolfpack, its radio communications. As detailed, the wolfpack tactic relied on a shadower U-boat making short radio transmissions to Dönitz's headquarters to vector in the pack. HUF-DUF was an ear. Fitted to the new, long-range escort groups, it could intercept these short transmissions and, by using a network of receivers, provide an almost instantaneous, precise bearing on the U-boat's location. The hunter-killer groups, led by brilliant anti-submarine captains like Frederick John Johnny Walker, no longer had to wait for the pack to attack. They could use the HUF-DUF bearing to pounce on the shadow a Times U-boat, killing the scout before it could even assemble the pack. This triad of death, Hedgehog for the depths, 10-centimeter radar for the surface, and HUF-DUF for the airwaves when combined on a single, dedicated escort, created a true hunter-killer. The U-boat had nowhere to hide. If it stayed submerged, Hedgehog would find it. If it surfaced at night, radar would find it. If it transmitted a single short radio signal, HUF-DUF would find it. The technological playing field had not just been leveled, it had been tilted catastrophically against the submarine. The only piece of the puzzle still missing was the final component to close the Black Pit itself. The Black Pit was not just a place on a map. It was a problem of physics, a 1,000-mile-wide vacuum created by the tyranny of fuel consumption. For years, The Allies' land-based aircraft had been tethered to the shore, their patrols ending just as the U-boat's prime hunting ground began. The technological triad of radar, Huff Duff, and Hedgehog had armed the escorts, but the escorts were still a thin, embattled line. To win, the Allies had to find a way to project this new, lethal technology, times over, times the convoys, deep into the gap. The solution was not another ship. It was a wing. It was the consolidated B-24 Liberator. The B-24 was an oddity of aviation design. It was not beautiful like a Spitfire or a Mustang. It was an ungainly, slab-sided, utilitarian beast of a machine. But it possessed one war-winning characteristic, the Davis wing. This high aspect ratio wing was, in essence, a giant airborne fuel tank, designed for minimal drag and maximum endurance. While the B-17 Flying Fortress was the more famous bomber, the B-24 was the long-distance hauler. Stripped of its heavy armor and bomb bay load and stuffed with extra fuel tanks, the B-24 became the VLR Very Long-Range Patrol Aircraft. It could fly for 18, 20, even 22 hours. It could take off from Newfoundland, fly 1,000 miles out into the Atlantic, loiter over a convoy for hours, and then fly times on times to Iceland or Northern Ireland to land. The Black Pit, a void defined by the range of lesser aircraft, was about to be closed. Air Marshal Sir John Slessor, who took command of RAF Coastal Command in 1943, was one of the few who understood this from the start. He had fought a bitter, bureaucratic war with Bomber Harris, the Chief of Bomber Command, who hoarded the VLR Liberators for his strategic bombing campaign over Germany. Slessor argued, in countless memoranda, that the Battle of the Atlantic was the only times battle that mattered. "It is no use," he wrote, "our winning the land divided by air battle, if we lose the war at sea. And we are in mortal danger of doing so." When Slessor finally secured his precious handful of VLR squadrons, he deployed them with a killer's precision. For the crews of Coastal Command, this was a new, grueling kind of war. Their memoirs are not filled with the high-octane dogfights of fighter pilots. They are a testament to crushing, mind-numbing boredom, punctuated by moments of sheer terror. A patrol was an 18-hour ordeal, sitting in a freezing, unpressurized metal tube, lulled into a stupor by the drone of the 4 engines, staring at an endless, featureless expanse of grey water. The strain on the eyes was immense, the hunt for the feather of a periscope or the wake of a surfaced U-boat a seemingly hopeless task. But these new B-24 seconds were armed with the game-changing 10-centimeter microwave radar. The U-boat crews had no idea. Their Metox receivers, which warned them of older radars, were silent. They still believed the mid-Atlantic gap was their safe haven, the one place they could surface in daylight to recharge their batteries, ventilate their boat, and give their men a brief respite on the conning tower. As Herbert Werner described in Iron Coffins, the U-boat crews of 1,942 would surface in the gap with a sense of relief, out of range of the dreaded land-based aircraft. The B-24 turned this sanctuary into a graveyard. A U-boat, surfaced and recharging, was a perfect fat target on the new radar screens. The Liberator crew, 50 miles away and hidden in the low, thick clouds, would get a blip. They would ride the radar beam in, dropping down out of the overcast sky, engines throttled back. For the U-boat crew, the first warning of an attack was no longer the bleep of a Metox. It was the sudden, deafening roar of 4 Pratt & Whitney engines, appearing from a cloud bank just 500 feet above them. By the time they heard it, the B-24's depth charges, set to explode at a shallow 25 feet, were already in the air. The U-boat, caught in a crash dive, was a sluggish, vulnerable target, and the accurately placed charges would rupture its pressure hull, sending it and its crew on its final, one-way dive to the bottom. The statistical proof of the VLR Liberator's impact is staggering. It is the statistical hammer that broke the wolfpack. Before 1943, the vast majority of U-boat kills were credited to surface escorts. The charts of Axis data show the killed-by-aircraft line as almost flat. Then, in the spring of 1943, as the B-24 seconds are finally deployed in force, that line skyrockets. It goes almost vertical. In May 1943 alone, of the 41 U-boats sunk, 20 were killed by aircraft, and another 8 were killed in joint operations by aircraft and ships. The VLR Liberator was the great enabler. It was not just a killer in its own right. It was the eye for the entire system. It could spot a U-boat, force it to submerge where it was slow and blind, and then hand off the contact to the naval escort groups, which could use their Huff Duff and Hedgehog to finish the job. The B-24 was the final linchpin. It was the delivery system that took the entire triad of Allied anti-submarine technology and deployed it deep into the U-boat's own, previously untouchable, backyard. The black pit was no longer black. It was illuminated by radar, and it was patrolled by a new, long-range angel of death. The stage was now set for the single, climactic month that would see the U-boat arm, which had come so close to victory, completely and utterly broken. The new technologies, the microwave radar, the B-24, the Hedgehog mortar were a loaded gun placed in the Allies' hand. But a gun, no matter how advanced, is useless without a soldier who knows how to shoot. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by scientists in a lab, it was won by sailors in a storm, and the man who personified this lethal new capability was Captain Frederick John Johnny Walker. Walker was not a defender. He was not a shepherd. He was a hunter, and his personal logs, action reports, and tactical memoranda form the hunter's diary of the Allied counter-offensive. He was the man who turned the cold science of anti-submarine warfare into a brutal, lethal art form. Walker was a man possessed. A career naval officer who had been passed over for promotion, he was given command of the 36th Escort Group in 1941, and then, critically, the 2nd Support Group in 1943. This difference was revolutionary. A standard escort group was tethered to a convoy, a defensive screen reacting to attacks. A support group, by contrast, was a true hunter-killer pack. They were unleashed, free to roam the Atlantic, vectored by the new Huff Duff and B-24 intelligence to find and destroy U-boat wolfpacks, times before times they could even find a convoy. Walker's flotilla, composed of 6 sloops, including his flagship, HMS × Starling *, was a team he had trained to an orchestral pitch of lethality. He was not just aggressive, he was innovative. He studied the U-boat, thought like his enemy, and developed a series of ruthless, patient tactics. His most famous was the creep attack, a method so cold and so precise that it gave the U-boat crews no chance. The U-boat's primary defense, when being hunted by ASDIC, was its own set of ears, the hydrophones. A submerged U-boat commander could hear the ping of the ASDIC, and more importantly, he could hear the high-speed propeller cavitation of an escort racing in for a depth-charge run, giving him a precious final minute to dive deep or turn sharply. Walker's official action reports, the primary evidence of his genius, detail how he eliminated this defense. The creep tactic used 2 ships. Walker, in HMS × Starling *, would gain ASDIC contact, and then deliberately time stop *, holding the U-boat in his sonar beam from a distance, just pinging passively. The U-boat commander, hearing the pings but times not times hearing the sound of an approaching destroyer, would be confused, held in a state of suspended terror. Then, Walker would vector in his second ship, HMS × Wild Goose × or × Kite *, which would approach the U-boat's position from its stern, its hydrophone blind spot, at a creeping speed, often just 5 knots. The × Wild Goose × would have its own ASDIC off, making no noise, its engines muffled. It was a silent, stalking predator. As his reports state, the U-boat was held by × Starlings × ASDIC, while × Wild Goose × moved in, unheard, to a position directly overhead. Then, on Walker's signal, * Wild Goose × would drop a single, lethally precise pattern of hedgehog mortars or depth charges, with the U-boat having zero warning. Walker's own description of a kill in a June 1943 report is chilling in its clinical triumph. He describes hunting U-202. I had him in ASDIC. I was playing with him, turning him this way and that. Then I brought in Time's wild goose asterisk. The U-boat must have been in a state of complete bewilderment. The resulting explosions were followed by a very loud and prolonged rumbling noise, as of a great internal disintegration. This was not just a sinking, it was a vivisection, orchestrated by a man who had perfected the kill. His swamp tactic was even more brutal, a pre-planned saturation attack where his entire group would, for hours, plaster a suspected U-boat's last known position with hundreds of depth charges, an overwhelming, inescapable bombardment designed to shatter the nerves and the hull of any U-boat trapped within it. But this relentless hunt came at an extreme personal cost. This is the dual conflict of the hunter's diary. Walker's personal letters to his wife, detailed in his biography, paint a picture of a man being consumed by his own mission. He was driven, obsessive, and on the edge of collapse for nearly 2 straight years. He rarely slept, often spending 72 hours straight on the bridge of times, starling times during a hunt, subsisting on cigarettes and nervous energy. His men, who adored him, noted his haggard appearance, his burning eyes, and the fact that he would often play a gramophone record of "A Hunting We Will Go" over the ship's loudspeakers as they raced toward a Huff-Duff contact. He was, as one of his officers noted, burning himself out with a terrible, bright flame. He felt every loss personally and celebrated every kill with a near-religious fervor, seeing himself as a crusader in a holy war against an unambiguous evil. His reports are filled with triumphant, almost non-regulation phrases like, "Got him," and another one for the bag. But this superhuman intensity was unsustainable. The man who had, by 1944, become the most celebrated naval hero in Britain, personally responsible for sinking more U-boats than any other commander, was a hollowed-out shell. He was the human embodiment of the new, 24-hour, technologically driven, all-or-nothing war. The U-boat commanders had no respite, and in his pursuit, Walker gave himself none either. He was the perfect, tireless predator the Allies needed, the man who finally turned the tide in the hunter-hunted relationship, and it would ultimately, and literally, kill him. His logs are the proof that the new technologies required a new, relentless, and self-sacrificial kind of warrior to wield them. The spring of 1943 was the hinge point of the Second World War. On the Eastern Front, the Wehrmacht was reeling from the catastrophe of Stalingrad. In the skies over Germany, Allied bombers were beginning to escalate their devastating campaign. And in the North Atlantic, Karl Dönitz, now Grand Admiral and Commander-in-Chief of the entire German Navy, was preparing his master stroke. After years of pleading, he finally had his force. His 300 U-boats were on station. He had over 100 boats at sea, prowling the convoy routes. He believed he was on the verge of finally achieving his 700,000-ton monthly quota, of breaking the convoy system, and of winning the war. He was about to unleash the largest wolfpack offensive in history. What Dönitz did not fully comprehend was that the Allies were also ready. The Black Pit was closed. The VLR Liberators were flying their overlapping patrols, armed with the 10-centimeter radar that was invisible to German detectors. The new hunter-killer support groups, led by men like Johnny Walker, were now at sea, loosed from their defensive tethers and hungry for the hunt. The triad of radar, Huff-Duff, and Hedgehog was finally integrated into a single, lethal system. The stage was set for the final, climactic battle of the Tonnage War. The month was May 1943. History would call it Black May. The battle that defined the turning point began in the last week of April. Convoy ONS-5, a slow-moving 43-ship convoy, was plodding west from Britain to North America. It was a slow convoy, composed of ships that could only make 7 knots, and it was sailing into the teeth of a force 10 gale. It was also sailing directly into the largest concentration of U-boats ever assembled. Dönitz, from his command bunker, was tracking ONS-5 and vectored in no fewer than 40 U-boats for a mass execution. This was to be the Antarctic in its ultimate form, an attack so overwhelming it would shatter the convoy and its escort. Commanding the escort was Commander Peter Gretton, the same officer who had witnessed the inadequacies of the Flower-class corvettes in the Black Pit. Now, he had a new, more powerful B-7 escort group, but even with better ships, the situation was desperate. For a week, ONS-5 was subjected to a running, brutal, chaotic battle, fought in hurricane-force winds and mountainous seas. Gretton's own action report captures the chaos. For 6 days, the battle raged. U-boats were all around us. The air was filled with signals. Ships were torpedoed and sinking in a matter of minutes. The wolfpack was inside the herd. Over the first few days, the U-boats, despite the hellish weather, pressed their attacks with a suicidal ferocity, sinking ship after ship. By May 5th, 13 merchant ships were at the bottom of the sea. It looked like a devastating German victory, but it was a catastrophic illusion. Gretton's escorts and the VLR aircraft that arrived from Newfoundland were fighting back with a lethality the U-boats had never encountered. The new 10-centimeter radar was pinning the U-boats in the darkness. Gretton's destroyers were getting clear, crisp contacts and running them down. The Hedgehog was proving its worth. The VLR Liberators, appearing from the clouds, were spotting the U-boats as they tried to reposition in the daylight. While ONS-5 lost 13 ships, the Wolfpack, in its victory, had paid an unsupportable price. 6 U-boats were sunk outright in the battle, and 7 more were so badly damaged by depth charges and air attack that they were forced to abandon the hunt and limp back to France. A 40-boat Wolfpack had been mauled, and the convoy, though battered, had survived. ONS-5 was only the beginning. The rest of May was not a battle. It was a slaughter. As convoy after convoy, HX-237, SC-129, SC-130 made the crossing, the new Allied system was unleashed in its full, coordinated fury. The VLR aircraft, guided by long-range intelligence, would spot the U-boat shadower, the scout. The support groups, like walkers, would be vectored in by Huff Duff. The U-boats, expecting to find a defenseless convoy, found themselves instead being hunted. They were depth-charged by aircraft they never saw, and stalked to exhaustion by patient, radar-equipped escorts. The statistical hammer of Black May 1943 is the most important and most devastating of the entire Atlantic campaign. In a single month, Dönitz's U-boat arm was, for all practical purposes, destroyed as a strategic force. The final numbers were catastrophic. In May 1943, the Allies sank 41 German U-boats. 8 were sunk by VLR Liberators. 6 were sunk by escort carrier aircraft. 20 were sunk by surface escorts. Many of these kills were joint, a testament to the new, integrated air-sea doctrine. 41 boats in 31 days. This was a full times, quarter times of Dönitz's entire front-line operational fleet in the Atlantic. In return, Allied shipping losses, which had been at a terrifying 400,000 tons in March, dropped off a cliff to less than 100,000 tons for the same period. The kill ratio had inverted, catastrophically. The Allies were now sinking U-boats faster than Speer could build them. Karl Dönitz, the man who had waged this war by cold, hard mathematics, could read the ledger. The numbers were unambiguous. His tonnage war had failed. On May 24th, 1943, faced with the undeniable, crushing statistics of Black May, the Grand Admiral of the Kriegsmarine picked up his pen and, in his official war diary, Kriegstagebuch, admitted defeat. His entry is the epitaph for the entire German strategy. We have lost the Battle of the Atlantic. The enemy has new weapons, radar, and air power, which make the U-boat a submerged target once more. We are faced with a new situation, We must withdraw. That same day, he issued the order for the surviving U-boats to abandon the North Atlantic convoy routes. The happy time was over. The wolves were not just defeated, they were broken. Black May was the definitive, irreversible turning point. The lifeline was no longer being severed, it was secure. The path for the invasion of Europe was now open, paved by the production of Kaiser's yards and secured by the technology of the Allied labs. Black May 1943 was the end of the Battle of the Atlantic as a strategic campaign. The Tonnage War was over. The lifeline was secure. The Allies had won. But the battle times itself, the daily, brutal, one-on-one violence in the cold dark, was not. For the men of the U-boot WWII, the war would continue for 2 more agonizing years. But the nature of this war had changed, fundamentally and irreversibly. The roles were now reversed. The U-boat was no longer the hunter, the apex predator of the happy time. It was now the prey. This was the endgame, a cornered wolf, fighting a hopeless battle of survival against an enemy that was now, finally, all-seeing, all-powerful, and relentless. Karl Dönitz, in a state of strategic shock, was forced into a desperate reactive posture. He had to find a technological counter to the Allies' total radar and air supremacy. His engineers, in a rush of desperate innovation, produced 2 wonder weapons they hoped would turn the tide back. The first was the Schnorchel, or snorkel, a retractable breathing mast that allowed a U-boat to run its diesel engines and thus recharge its vital batteries while remaining submerged at periscope depth. On paper, it was a brilliant solution. It meant the U-boat no longer had to surface at all, theoretically making it invisible to the radar-equipped B-24 and destroyers. In practice, the Schnorchel was a technological torture device. It turned the already cramped U-boat into a living sewer pipe. To function, the U-boat had to creep along at a near-silent 5 knots, just 30 feet below the waves, for hours. The snorkel's head valve would often slam shut in rough seas, and the massive diesel engines, still running, would instantaneously suck the air out of the boat. The pressure change was so violent it would pop men's eardrums, tear at their lungs, and cause their eyes to bulge. The air that was recirculated was foul, thick with diesel fumes, carbon monoxide, and the stench of unwashed bodies. Crews suffered from splitting headaches, nausea, and crippling psychological stress. Worse, the U-boat was now deaf and blind. While snorkeling, the boat's own hydrophones were deafened by the roar of its own engines, and the commander was blind, unable to use his periscope without risking the snorkel's detection. Herbert Werner, in Iron Coffins, described the shift. We had lost our eyes. We were no longer hunters, but a blind, deaf mole, creeping along the ocean floor, praying not to be stepped on. The snorkel, designed to save the U-boat, had merely turned it into a slower, more miserable, and ultimately, still detectable target. The second wonder weapon was the T5 Zaunkönig, or Wren, an acoustic homing torpedo. This was a fire-and-forget weapon, a technological marvel. Fired in the general direction of a convoy, its internal hydrophones would listen for the high-pitched sound of a destroyer's fast-moving propellers and steer directly into it. For a brief, terrifying period in late 1943, it worked. Allied escorts, who had grown bold and aggressive, suddenly found themselves the target. Several destroyers and corvettes were sunk, including the flagship of an escort group, sending a wave of panic through the Allied command. But the Allies were no longer the lumbering, reactive bureaucracy of 1940. They were a taut, efficient, industrial and scientific killing machine. Within weeks' times of capturing the first T5, Allied scientists had it analysed, reverse-engineered, and had developed a perfect, simple, and mass-producible counter. It was codenamed Foxer. It was nothing more than a set of parallel pipes, towed 200 yards behind the escort, that was rattled by the ship's wake. This Foxer gear produced a massive, swirling, chaotic noise that was, to the T5's primitive acoustic sensors, far louder and more attractive than the escort's propellers. The T-5, chasing the loudest sound, would swerve from the ship and harmlessly detonate on the towed decoy. The wonder weapon that had taken Germany years to develop was neutralized in a matter of weeks by a simple piece of towed plumbing. This was the new reality for the U-boat crews in 1944 and 1945. Their mission was no longer sink 700,000 tons. It was simply survive. But survival was a statistical impossibility. The primary evidence from this period, found in the harrowing memoirs of the few survivors, is a litany of sheer, unrelenting terror. Herbert Werner's Iron Coffins is the definitive text of this hopeless slaughter. He describes patrols where the U-boat was hunted, relentlessly, for days on end, by multiple, overlapping hunter-killer groups like Johnny Walker's. The psychological torture was the worst part. The ping of the ASDIC was a constant, nerve-shredding tap-tap-tap on the hull. The crews, trapped in the foul air, could only sit in silence, listening as the destroyers above them crept into position, or as Walker's gramophone blared "A hunting we will go" over the loudspeakers, "A deliberat, cruel taunt." Then came the swamp attack. The sky would fall. Werner writes of a storm of steel, the boat bucking and heaving, lights shattering, cork insulation falling, men screaming or praying. The depth charges would explode for hours, the air becoming unbreathable, the bilges filling with water, the captain, exhausted, trying to find an escape route that no longer existed. This was not warfare, it was an execution. Werner's boat was one of the very few to survive, and he chronicled the fate of his comrades, of boats that sailed and simply vanished. They were vaporized by aircraft, crushed by hedgehog mortars, or stalked to exhaustion by the support groups. The final statistical hammer of the U-boat campaign is the most brutal and devastating of the entire Second World War. It is the human cost of this failed, hopeless, attritional endgame. Of the approximately 40,000 men who served in the WWII, over 30,000 never returned. This was a casualty rate of 75%. No other branch of service, in any nation, on any side of the conflict, suffered a loss rate that was even remotely comparable. The German U-boat arm, which began the war as the elite, laughing, happy-time hunters, the heroes of the Reich, was ultimately and knowingly sacrificed. They were, in the end, nothing more than men trapped in steel coffins, sent out on a one-way mission to die, not for victory, but to simply buy the Third Reich a few more weeks of time. The Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic was forged by a triad of lethal technologies and the courage of the Royal Navy. But it was times guaranteed, times by a force that had nothing to do with the tactical battle at sea. It was guaranteed by the sheer, crushing, unstoppable weight of the industrial hammer, a force embodied by a single, humble, and deeply flawed ship, the Liberty. While Part 6 examined the production miracle of times, how times these ships were built, it is here we must analyze the profound operational times, impact times of this flood of steel. The Liberty ship was not a weapon. It was the ultimate expression of the Tonnage War's brutal arithmetic, a bludgeon that, by its very existence, ensured the rapier of the U-boat could never, ever win. The Liberty ship was not a good ship. In fact, by traditional naval standards, it was a terrible one. It was a 5-year vessel, designed with a lifespan of 50,000 miles, just enough to survive a few Atlantic crossings. It was slow, with a single, obsolete, triple-expansion steam engine that could only push its 10,000-ton bulk through the water at a plodding 11 knots, dangerously slow, and often slower than the convoys it was in. But its most infamous flaw was a terrifying symptom of its revolutionary construction. Henry J. Kaiser, in his quest for speed, had replaced slow, laborious riveting with fast industrial welding. But in the frigid, -30-degree waters of the North Atlantic, this new technique revealed a fatal weakness. The steel, improperly understood, would become brittle. The welded seams, which had no give, unlike a riveted plate, would create brittle fractures. Merchant marine memoirs are filled with the terror of this phenomenon. A seaman, sitting in the mess hall, would hear a sound, not an explosion, but a sharp crack, like a pistol shot, or, as one survivor described it, like a giant tearing a sheet of paper. They would race to the deck to find the ship had simply, and catastrophically, split in two. Several Liberty ships, like the SS × Schenectady *, broke in half while sitting perfectly still in harbour. They were, in a very real sense, a calculated industrial risk. But this dual conflict of the Liberty ship, its terrible flaws versus its impossible numbers, was the very thing that made it a war winner. The Allies did not need a times good times ship. They did not need a times fast times ship. They just needed times enough times ships, and they were getting them in a biblical flood. By 1943, over 2,700 of these expendable vessels would be built. This sheer, expendable quantity was a quality all its own, and it fundamentally changed Allied naval strategy. Before the Liberty miracle, the Allies had to scrape together any ship that could float old, 19th-century tramp steamers, neutral vessels, and new builds into a single, slow convoy that was forced to travel at the speed of its time's slowest times member. This, as we saw with ONS-5, made the convoy a large, slow, vulnerable target for the wolfpacks. But the flood of new Liberty ships, all capable of a reliable 11 knots, allowed the Admiralty to do something new. They could segregate the convoys. Fast convoys of 11 knots or more were created, composed entirely of new-build ships. The old, slow tramp ships were put in their own slow convoys. This simple, logistical move was a nightmare for Dönitz. It doubled or tripled the number of targets in the ocean, forcing his wolfpacks to spread thinner. It also meant that the most valuable, high-priority cargo was now moving at a faster, more reliable pace, spending less time in the danger zone. The U-boats, which were themselves not much faster than 11 knots when surfaced, now had to work harder, run their engines at full power, and burn precious fuel just to get into an attack position against a fast convoy. The industrial hammer was not just replacing losses, it was actively making the U-boat's job more difficult. The men who sailed these flawed, magnificent vessels were the unsung heroes of the Tonnage War. The sailors of the British Merchant Navy and the US Merchant Marine were the fourth branch of service, civilians in uniform who faced a casualty rate that was, in some theatres, higher than the combat troops. The US Merchant Marine, for instance, had a death rate of 1:26, a toll higher than any of the US armed forces, second only to the German U-boat crews they were fighting. Their primary evidence, their diaries and letters, speak of a unique kind of courage. They were not sailors on a warship, bristling with guns and depth charges. They were men on a floating box of explosives, oil or ammunition, whose only defence was a single, obsolete 4-inch gun on the stern. They knew, intimately, that their ship was a mass-produced, expendable object. They knew that its hull might crack in the cold. They knew that if a torpedo struck, their cargo of aviation fuel would vaporize them in an instant. And yet, they signed up for the North Atlantic run again and again. One survivor of a torpedoing, rescued after days on a raft, wrote, "We were sunk on a Friday. I was home by Monday. I was on a new Liberty ship on Wednesday." That was the war. This was the ultimate victory of the Liberty ship. It was the perfect, brutal answer to the Tonnage War. Dönitz's U-boats were a high-tech, precision-made rapier, crewed by an elite, fanatical brotherhood. They were trying to win a war of attrition. But the Allies, led by Kaiser, had responded by building an industrial hammer, a good enough bludgeon, in numbers that defied comprehension. They simply, and literally, filled the ocean with so much steel that the rapier had nothing to stab, and they crewed these expendable hulls with men of such ordinary, profound courage that the lifeline was never, ever broken. The war at sea began with a single, brutal, and arrogant act. On September 3rd, 1939, Kapitän-Leutnant Fritz Julius Lemp, commanding U-30, watched the liner SS Athenia, a ship filled with civilians, settle into the cold Atlantic. That single torpedo was a statement of intent, the opening shot in a tonnage war that Germany was, at that moment, supremely confident it would win. That sinking, and the happy time that followed, was defined by Allied helplessness. It was a war of the rapier, of the U-boat ace, of the lone, invisible hunter operating with impunity. The Allies were blind, their escorts were feeble, and their industrial base was asleep. For 2 years, the wolf was master of the fold. Now, let us bookend that moment with the scene on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe is over. Adolf Hitler is dead in his Berlin bunker, and in a bizarre final twist of the Third Reich's downfall, the man who now holds the title of Führer, the last leader of Germany, is Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the man who had been the architect of the U-boat war, the high priest of the tonnage war, was now the one who had to sign its unconditional surrender. From his new headquarters in Flensburg, Dönitz, the Lion, broadcast one final, coded message to the men he still called my boys, the shattered remnant of his U-boot waffy. His final order, a piece of primary evidence that signaled the end of the longest, most brutal campaign of the war, was one of resignation, not defiance. My U-boat men, 6 years of U-boat war lie behind us. You have fought like lions. A crushing material superiority has compressed us into a narrow area. A continuation of the struggle is impossible. We bow in deep respect to our fallen comrades. We lay down our arms. Dönitz. All across the Atlantic the order was received. And then, a surreal and silent spectacle began. One by one, the U-boats that had been creeping through the depths, the iron coffins of the final, hopeless patrols, began to surface. But they did not surface to attack. They surfaced, ran up a black flag of surrender, and, as per Allied instructions, began broadcasting their positions in plain English. From the Arctic to the Caribbean, the hunters who had become the hunted simply gave up. They sailed, defeated, into Allied ports, at Loch Erebor in Scotland, and in ports in Canada and the United States. The convoys of surrendered U-boats formed a grim, final parade, the once proud grey wolves now tamed, their crews shuffling onto the docks as prisoners of war, their war diaries and logbooks handed over, the great hunt finally, definitively over. This is the why of the Battle of the Atlantic. This is the restatement of the thesis established in the smoke of the sinking Athenia. The U-boats were winning, their early dominance was real, but it was a tactical dominance that was, in the end, crushed by a superior times system asterisk. The war was not a duel of aces. It was not Otto Kretschmer versus Johnny Walker. It was a war of systems, a war of attrition, and Germany's system lost. The U-boat's rapier, so lethal in 1940, was ultimately broken and melted down by the sheer, overwhelming, systemic bludgeon of Allied ingenuity and industrial might. That Allied system was twofold. It was the triad of technology, the 10-centimeter radar that stole the night, the high-frequency duff that stole the radio waves, and the VLR Liberator that stole the Black Pit itself, all wielded by patient, relentless hunters. And it was the industrial hammer, the unstoppable 24-hour miracle of Kaiser's shipyards. The Liberty ship, a flawed but numberless vessel, filled the ocean with so much steel that the tonnage war became a mathematical impossibility for Germany. Dönitz could not sink them fast enough, and the new Allied technology meant that every U-boat he sent out to try-times was, by 1944, on a near-certain suicide mission. The ultimate price for this victory, and this defeat, is written in a ledger of blood that is almost too vast to comprehend. Over 36,000 Allied merchant seamen died, the men of the Fourth Branch, who had no weapons, only the courage to keep sailing. But the cost for the U-boot WAF, for the men Dönitz sacrificed in the final, hopeless years, was the most staggering of the entire war. Of the 40,000 men who went to sea, over 30,000 never came home, a 75% casualty rate. A generation of young men, sent to their deaths in iron coffins at the bottom of the sea, long after the war was strategically lost. But the ultimate prize of this victory was nothing less than the liberation of Europe. The Battle of the Atlantic was the one, true, existential battle of the war for the Western Allies. Had it been lost, Britain would have starved. The island would have been cut off. The industrial might of America would have been stranded on the wrong side of the ocean. There would have been no bomber offensive. There would have been no D-Day. The vast 6,000-ship armada that assembled in June 1944, the men, the tanks, the fuel, and the bullets that landed on the beaches of Normandy, were only possible because the Tonnage War had been won. The Atlantic was no longer a hunting ground. It was a highway, a massive, secured conveyor belt for the invasion. The longest, most grueling, and most important campaign of the war had been won, not by a single act of heroism, but by the slow, painful, and perfect integration of industry, science, and sacrifice